I'm Eric Hakula, and this is one in a series of presentations based on my book, The Economics of Planning. Today's presentation focuses primarily on Chapter 4, The Economics of Urban Structure. In this presentation, we'll do several things. Beginning, introduce the basic monocentric model of urban structure, explain the concept of bid-rent curves, describe those bid-rent curves as kind of spatial indifference curves, show how bid-rent curves help determine land use densities, and show how competing land use types are reconciled within that model, the monocentric model. We'll also show how population or income growth impacts the bid-rent curve. Likewise, we'll show how changes in technology, particularly technology associated with mobility, transportation, will affect the bid-rent curves. Then we will introduce the polycentric model of urban structure and illustrate that within the context of Los Angeles, a famous polycentric urban agglomeration. So let's get started. We begin with this monocentric model of urban structure that is associated primarily with Professor William Alonso of Harvard, although he was originally from Argentina, and Buenos Aires actually happens to be a very nice example of monocentric urban form. So it's all very fitting and appropriate. Professor Alonso was an extremely nice gentleman. I had the good fortune to spend a little bit of time with him on a couple of occasions, and truly wonderful gentleman. His book, Location and Land Use, from the mid-1960s, really set the foundation for so much of urban economics subsequent to that. And the core of that book, the core idea, has to do with bid-rent curve. And I like to encourage folks to think of the bid-rent curve as a kind of indifference curve. Right? It essentially shows the trade-off between accessibility and affordability. In the monocentric model, as the name suggests, that model is premised on a primary or single urban core. And the model looks to explain how different land uses and how land prices are arranged relative to location from that core. So we've got and the essential point is that accessibility has value. And this is a very simple and straightforward concept. It's one thing that's less obvious is this idea of the bid-rent curve as being a kind of locational indifference curve. So if we think of a whole city full of identical individuals. Now, of course, cities are not filled with identical individuals. There's a great deal of variety. But if we look at how this model would function with that premise, with that assumptions in mind, it's interesting to see that this slope, this gradient, a bid-rent curve with a gradient sloping down as it moves away from the CBD, the central business district, is the result of identical individuals. Right? So it's not that some people are more inclined to live close and others are more inclined to live further away. We all, in this sort of conceptual experiment, we all value accessibility to the same degree. And that's why we bid up, right? If there are two plots of land, we'd be willing to pay more for one that is closer to the CBD. But the flip side of that is money in the pocket, right? So what you're not paying on rent to have accessibility remains in your pocket for other consumption items. So if we think of this as a kind of household budget decision, and accessibility is in effect one good that households can purchase, but they have many other goods that they're also looking to purchase. And so there's the trade-off. And if we were all identical, we'd be approaching that trade-off in the same way. And the equilibrium result would occur where none of us is able to sort of get an edge by changing our location. If I were located at one spot, I'd say, well, I could be more accessible if I were to move closer in, but then I'm missing out on money in my pocket for other things. And on balance, I'm indifferent. And so we, in a sense, we all line up along this indifference curve, this bid rent curve. And that's where it actually shows that this simplifying assumption is powerful, that we don't need different people with different preferences in order to get this result. Now, this is a starting point. One thing for why we get higher densities in locations that are closer to the core, and that has to do with the fact that as we've seen, when you're closer to the core in this monocentric model, the prices along the bid rent curve are higher. Now, from a microeconomic production perspective, we can think about developers who are producing homes or office buildings, etc., and think of two basic factor inputs to that production. One is land, and the other is, we'll call it capital. So it's all the other stuff that goes into the building, right? Now, the challenge for the developer is to deliver certain quality of kind of benchmarked level of accommodation or office space, etc., in the most efficient possible way. Now, when you've got two inputs, land and capital, when land is more expensive, you're going to want to trade off and substitute capital for land. That means you've got more sort of building per unit of land, and that's higher density. So that's a result that follows immediately from this monocentric model and the bid rent curve that emerges from it. The model is also useful for showing how to reconcile different land uses. So in this representation, we have commercial land, residential, industrial, and agricultural. And the basic idea here is that the value of an additional increment of accessibility will be more for some activities than for other. And so in this representation, the bid rent curve for commercial land is the steepest, then residential land, then industrial. And as shown here, agricultural land is presumed to be the rent, or the value associated with agricultural land is presumed to be independent here of distance to the downtown core. So that means that for commercial uses, the value of accessibility, the marginal valuation of an increment of accessibility is higher than for the others. And so they're going to outbid residential uses and industrial uses. And the resulting formation is as shown here. And so the dotted lines underneath are sort of the part of the bid rent curve associated with different land use types that don't sort of win the bid. So the winning bid is shown in this dark outline, the kind of envelope of these underlying bid rent curves associated with each of the land uses. And they reconcile in this way. So they're bidding against each other in land markets. And the result is shown below, which is in this basic monocentric model, there's a center, and then distance from the center is the key defining locational element. And so the natural result is a sort of circular pattern in this model, because a circle defines all locations that are of a given distance from that core. Now, this model can also accommodate changes. It's useful to think about how an increase in population, for example, or an income growth will impact the bid rent curve. Well, upon reflection, I think it's fairly clear that if additional population moves into this urban area, and again, if we think that all of the individuals here are the same, have the same kind of preferences as those who are already there, well, then the value of an additional increment of accessibility hasn't changed in any significant way, right? So we can think about essentially the bid rent curve after this influx of population would be parallel to the original bid rent curve prior to that population influx. And so the result is, as shown here, a kind of a movement out of that bid rent curve, a movement out and up, because essentially what's happening is if previously you had 100 people bidding for land along a given segment, and a certain bid rent curve emerged, and now if you've got 150 people or 150,000 people or 15 million people instead of 10 million people who are bidding for the same land, then they're going to have to bid more because there's more demand, and that's driving up price. So the winning bid is going to have to be higher if you're bidding against a larger crowd. So that's fairly intuitive. And then we can see that as that bid rent curve shifts up and out, then the point at which agricultural land rents exceed the bid rent curve value will be further removed from the center. And so this is an economic explanation of how population growth expands the urban area. Essentially, there's more bidding for land, and that bidding is going to spill over and encroach upon what was previously agricultural land use. Now, a different story is told in the context of changing technology. So, for example, if we have faster cars, or could also be due to things like infrastructure improvements, transportation infrastructure improvements, so that if there is enhanced mobility, so that actually affects, and this is not looking at increased population here, it's just saying, let's suppose that we have a constant population, but due to changes in technology or other factors such as infrastructure improvements, et cetera, more virtual commuting, for example, then the value of accessibility is lowered. So there's a kind of twofold element here then to how the bid rent curve changes, as shown here. The first is that the bid rent curve becomes flatter, right? And so that's shown here at this kind of movement number 1, which shows that the bid rent curve, which was steep to a certain extent, now becomes flatter, because the additional value associated with being an increment closer to the core is less, because we can overcome that impediment of distance more easily. Now, the second part of the story here is that the height of the bid rent curve will adjust so that, at least on a first approximation, the area beneath that bid rent curve, once it sort of settles back into its new equilibrium, the area under that curve will be roughly the same as it was prior to that change in technology. And the basic intuition there is that while the technology has changed and our perception of the value of accessibility has changed, how much we're spending on land versus other things is not really hasn't changed fundamentally in any way. Our preferences are still the same in terms of location versus other household goods. So at least as a first approximation, if we assume that households are spending the same amount on accessibility as they were prior to this, it's just that accessibility is manifest in this spreading out. And so this is the configuration that we get. And so again, as in the previous example of an increase in population, here with this enhanced mobility, with the lower impedance brought about by distance, there's that indifference curve that's represented, that spatial indifference curve that's represented by the bid rent curve, is flattened, and it moves out and extends, and again encroaches upon what was previously agricultural rents. Now we move to polycentric models, and clearly this is referring to the possibility of many centers rather than one. Now, the same kinds of results that we derive in the context of the monocentric model apply as well to the polycentric case, in terms of the meaning of the bid rent curves, the value of accessibility, the effect of population change or changes in technology. All of those things can be worked out as well in a similar sort of logic. The underlying math may be a little bit more complicated, but the logic does not change so much. What is new is that there are now dual and possibly multiple locations that are relevant. So it's not just a question of how far am I from the central district, it's how far am I to the central districts, or these various urban centers, or to amenities. How far am I from the beach? How far am I from other sort of attractors? And so over recent decades, there's been much more work done in terms of modeling the structure of urban areas and the economic structure, looking at the land rents in particular, and how those are worked out relative to models and settings where there are multiple attractors. And the basic idea is as represented here, where it's a kind of additive, that if you're somewhere in the middle between center one and center two, there's a kind of value associated with both. Now, if these centers were in some ways redundant, so that going to center one and going to center two is essentially the same experience, having a second center may or may not have as much, it's not likely to have as much advantage. But the basic idea is that being located, having multiple attractors, being in a location that is accessible to multiple attractors is going to have more value. And so that's represented here by that additive value of accessibility. And this effect is even more pronounced in the context of different centers, where the centers are not simply replicates of each other. So there's less mutual redundancy in terms of those centers. But if one is a kind of a downtown commercial core, another is an entertainment core, different kinds of uses, then they are complementary rather than substitutes. And so that value effect may be even stronger. Now, a lot of the work that's been done on polycentric cities has been done here in Los Angeles, and including right here at USC. The number of my colleagues and myself have done work in this area, including Professor Jen Giuliano, whose work I'm drawing on for this representation, which based on some of the research she's done, she and her colleagues have done, looking at the different centers that emerge in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, and showing that these centers themselves are associated with distinct land use activities. Some are centers affiliated with arts and services, others with kind of a mix of public and administrative services. Others are manufacturing type centers, others are information oriented, others are health and education oriented. So there are a number of sort of clusters and attractors that stand out when you look at the data on land use and on land prices, and in the context of places like Los Angeles. And this is true of many other cities around the world as well. So in the next presentation, I'm going to extend a bit more on the urban structure and look at some other kinds of models of urban structure that have also been used by scholars. See you then.